An Egyptian proposal to stop the conflict in the Gaza Strip collapses. Israel had accepted a ceasefire, but Hamas says it wasn't consulted. The result, both sides have resumed fighting. So is a ceasefire still possible, or will there be a further escalation in violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. The Israeli government has resumed missile strikes on the Gaza Strip despite earlier accepting a ceasefire deal brokered by Egypt. But the ceasefire was unlikely to hold for long. Hamas says the deal was done without it being consulted. The deal is aimed at ending some of the worst violence seen in Gaza in years. It's a confrontation that has killed more than 190 Palestinians, mostly civilians. International leaders have been pushing for a ceasefire, but it's unclear how it could have held without both parties being in agreement. Let's take a look at what the Egyptian government proposed. It called for both sides to cease hostilities from land, air and sea. That means Israel refraining from a ground invasion and an end to rocket fire from all Palestinian factions in the Gaza Strip. It also called for border crossings to open once the security situation becomes stable on the ground, and for talks on a long-term truce to take place in Cairo within 48 hours. Well, Al Jazeera spoke to Hamas spokesman Azzam, who says the group was not involved in any ceasefire negotiations.
Well, Hamas did not reject a real proposal. Hamas rejected such proposal to be introduced through the media, to talk about that's it, take it or not, it's not going to happen. We are clear in that. This proposal must be discussed through a clear political channels. We want a fair ceasefire which will protect the Palestinians and will protect the will of the Palestinians and the future of the Palestinians.
While speaking before Israel resumed its strikes on Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said a refusal by Hamas to accept the ceasefire would give his country international legitimacy to carry on its campaign.
We agreed to the Egyptian proposal in order to give an opportunity for the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, from missiles, from rockets and from tunnels, through diplomatic means. But if Hamas does not accept the ceasefire proposal, as would now seem to be the case, Israel would have all international legitimacy to broaden the military operation to achieve the required quiet.
And the U.S. Secretary of State gave his full support for Israel and has some stinging criticism for Hamas.
I cannot condemn strongly enough the actions of Hamas in so brazenly firing rockets in multiple numbers in the face of a goodwill effort to offer a ceasefire in which Egypt and Israel have joined together, and the international community strongly supports the idea of a ceasefire. We urge all parties to support this ceasefire, and we support and we ask all the members of the Arab community, as they did yesterday at the Arab League meeting in Cairo, to continue to press to try to get Hamas to do the right thing here.
Well, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. In Istanbul, Azzam Tamimi, director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought. He's also the author of Hamas Unwritten Chapters. In Pittsburgh, we have Gregg, former advisor in the Israeli Knesset and a former official at the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And in Beirut, political analyst Joseph Kechichian. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Gregg Roman in Pittsburgh, if I can start with you. Why did Israel accept this Egyptian initiative in the first place when it wasn't even presented to Hamas? Was this just simply a tactic, a ploy, to continue its offensive on Gaza without the international condemnation?
I think that conspiracy theories that are being driven right now in Gaza through their spokesman Sami al-Musri and also Abu Marzouk in Cairo don't have any place at the table of peace. What we have right now is Hamas basically saying, in the words of the Palestinian ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council, that they need to be convinced to not commit crimes against humanity by launching rockets against Israeli civilians. So any notion that this is some kind of concoction between the Egyptian government, the West, and Israel in order to put a ploy where Hamas has to be able to all of a sudden lose its ability to launch rockets against Israel is, like I said before, a misnomer. The actual context of the situation is that Israel never wanted this fight, but it was Hamas that started it. And right now it's Hamas that continues to wish that Palestinian civilians will unfortunately have to die as they use their weapons and hide between civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and other areas. So if Hamas really didn't want Palestinian suffering, they would accept a ceasefire regardless of the way in which it was presented to them. And then under the agreement, they would be able to meet with Egyptian authorities to work out the final workings of a ceasefire and a truce to return to the 2012 understandings after Operation Pillar of Defense.
Okay. Let's get the view of our other guests on this.
There would be no further Palestinian deaths.
All right, let's get the view of our other guests and how this all played out in the last few hours. Dr. Azzam Tamimi in Istanbul. John Kerry, we heard John Kerry there give backing to Israel's acceptance of this ceasefire that was proposed by Egypt. He said the ball was in Hamas's court. Do you think Hamas should have accepted this ceasefire?
Well, Hamas, as a matter of principle, is not opposed to a ceasefire. It just wants first to be recognized as a party to this conflict, rather than everybody speaking about it as if it were absent or as if it were a ghost. And secondly, it wants any process to be a fair process. They are not confident that the current hostile regime in Cairo is likely to be fair to them. We already know what they've been saying about Hamas and what they've been actually doing against Hamas and against Gaza. And if you have a conflict between two sides, and the two sides clearly are Israel and Hamas, it is just ridiculous to conclude a deal between Israel and a mediator without the other party being consulted or involved at all.
Right. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas had welcomed the Egyptian initiative. Do you think that perhaps the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah was involved in the ceasefire negotiations? And if that's the case, what does that mean for the reconciliation deal, the unity deal among the Palestinian factions?
Well, Mahmoud Abbas is irrelevant to the entire process. I know he is being brought in here because there is something that is being cooked in the background. They want eventually to bring him back or bring his authority back to Gaza with the hope of demilitarizing Gaza or disarming Hamas. Of course, we've been hearing the spokespersons for Abbas in various places. They've been very hostile to Hamas. They've been very helpful to the Israelis. Actually, the Israelis are celebrating some of the comments made by Abbas's men against Hamas. Abbas is not a party to this deal. This deal should have been brokered by a third party between Israel and Hamas.
Joseph Kechichian in Beirut, how do you think this all went down? How could a deal, a ceasefire, be declared without both parties, Hamas and Israel, being involved?
Despite what Secretary of State John Kerry said, obviously there is a proportionality question at play here. Hamas did not want to start this fight, and it denied that in fact it kidnapped and killed the 3 Israeli young men a few weeks ago, because its political agenda was something entirely different. It wanted the release of a lot of prisoners that the Israelis hold. But now we are in front of a fait accompli, and there is a proportionality problem because the aerial bombardments of Gaza have been really overwhelming. The Israelis and the Egyptians probably had a deal going in order to strengthen the process that the Egyptians were involved in years past, but as your previous speakers have said, have been essentially on the sidelines because the Sisi government in Egypt has not really been very pro-Hamas, if you would like. So therefore, this was an attempt to essentially shoot 2 birds with a single stone, but apparently it did not work at this point.
What do you think is happening behind the scenes, if anything at all, between Hamas and the Sisi government in Egypt? Does the Sisi government in Egypt have leverage on Hamas, you think?
it would like to have leverage on Hamas, but it does not, clearly. And this was an attempt by, besides Israelis and Western powers, to actually bring the two sides together, even probably with the knowledge of President Mahmoud Abbas, in order to create some kind of a rapprochement, if you would like, between Sisi government and Hamas. But it's not working at this point because, as Hamas has repeatedly stated, it is not party to the negotiating process, and it would very much like to be part of the negotiating process. I think the Egyptians really need to reassess their involvement here, because in the long term, they have no choice but to deal with the Hamas leadership in Gaza, because they are on the borders themselves. And even though they can probably close some of these tunnels, probably close the crossings, and do a lot of other things, down the line, however, they've got to be some kind of a solution in order to liberate Gaza from its total asphyxiation.
All right, let's just take a look at the conditions set out by Hamas to a ceasefire. Hamas stated the terms on which it would agree to a ceasefire at the beginning of this latest conflict. They included lifting Israel's blockade on the Gaza Strip, the opening of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, which has been closed for most of the last week, and the release of Palestinian prisoners who Israel rearrested after freeing them in 2011. Some pretty tough conditions, tougher conditions than in the previous conflicts. Do you think, Azzam Tamimi in Istanbul, that it's a good idea to have such strong conditions when they're likely not to be met by the Israelis?
These are not strong conditions. These are fair and logical conditions. Israel has been exacting collective punishment on the Palestinians. All those that Israel has recaptured should not have been arrested again. They didn't do anything. They were in their homes. Israel used the incident of the 3 settlers as a pretext in order to carry its onslaught on Hamas and Hamas supporters in the West Bank, and also to carry its offensive against Gaza. So what actually Hamas is saying, we need to go back to what we agreed to previously. These were agreements. These were deals brokered by international actors, including the freeing of those whom Israel has recaptured. And you cannot have peace and tranquility if Gaza continues to be collectively punishment, if Gaza continues to be under siege. This has to end. This has to come to an end. Israel cannot continue to use its might and also the collaboration of despicable Arab regimes in the region to suffocate Gaza. This has to come to an end.
Let's get Gregg Roman in Pittsburgh to respond to that. And also, Gregg, the accusations that Israel used the death of these 3 young settlers a few weeks ago as a pretext to invade Gaza, as a pretext to bomb Gaza. What do you respond to that?
So there's 3 points here that we have to be able to analyze. The first is the case of the 3 youth who were murdered and shot in a field after they were kidnapped by Hamas terrorists.
But Hamas denied kidnapping and killing those 3 young settlers. They denied it. Why would they deny?
It's fine that they denied. It's fine that they denied it, and the reason why is so that they didn't provoke the kind of response that Israel is now meting out in Gaza. The second thing that we have to understand is that we have to condemn all forms of vigilante acts, whether they be by Hamas terrorists or by Jewish extremists. And the third item is to connect the murders in the West Bank with what's going on in Gaza right now. We must remember that the rocket fire precipitated the actions that were taking place in the West Bank and actually started parallel to what was going on in Hebron and in Ramallah. So by taking these 2 actions and equating them being one and the same conflict is different. As your previous speaker said, the political actions of what's going on in the West Bank and the political messaging of what's going on with the Hamas in Gaza are 2 different entities. Hamas is the odd man out when they have the Arab League, Egypt, major Arab regimes, the West, Russia, Israel, the United States, and almost every other international actor at the table, and they're not sitting at it, choosing to commit crimes against humanity against Israeli civilians in place of being able to negotiate peace. So there's 2 points here in the final conclusion that we have to look at. The first is, if Hamas truly wants to stop the so-called collective punishment of Gaza and the siege on Gaza and to have their conditions met, why would they not agree to a 12-hour truce, then to only meet in Cairo?
Because they say they weren't consulted on this truce. They say they weren't consulted, that this went on just between Israel and Egypt.
This was no consultation between Israel and Egypt. The way in which it was delivered was through the media. However, there's ongoing consultations between the deputy head of Hamas.
But is that okay? Is the way that it was delivered
the
right way to do it? Through the media? That's what they're saying exactly. Would Israel have agreed to a truce if it was delivered through the media?
I'm sorry that Hamas feels bad about the way in which a truce was delivered, but if they truly cared about Palestinian deaths, it wouldn't matter how the truce proposal was delivered. It would matter what they were willing to do when they answered it. So whether it came through an intermediary, through Egyptian intelligence, or it was broadcasted all around the world, why did they not accept the conditions in order to alleviate Palestinian suffering? The onus is on Hamas to answer that question.
All right, let me ask Joseph Kechichian, what's Hamas' position now? Gregg talks about them being the odd man out right now. Is that the case? Are they really in a weak position right now? And should they have accepted this truce?
Well, that is not the case simply because Hamas is a democratically elected political institution. I think that they are ostracized clearly throughout the Arab world and throughout the world, but the Palestinians have elected repeatedly Hamas leaders to positions of authority. So therefore, trying to delegitimize Hamas is really a lost cause. This, at the end of the day, I'm sure we're all adults and we can think through this. At the end of the day, this is not about Gaza. This is not about essentially attacks here or there. This is about a perennial fight that has been going on between two peoples fighting over the same land. This is about land at the end of the day. We have to admit this, and both sides have got to realize that an ultimate solution will not occur unless there are serious discussions over land. And Hamas is a party of this community. It cannot be ostracized. It cannot be dismissed. And it has to have a place at the table. Now, having said all of this, I will be the first one to acknowledge that this is easier said than done because there are outside interferences, because there is an Iranian role with Hamas, because of the Egyptian role in the region, because of the repercussions of the Arab Spring throughout the opposition groups, if you would like. But at the end of the day, all of this will have to be put aside if, in fact, true peace has got to be found on this perennial question. Land problems must be addressed first, second, and third.
All right. Dr. Azzam, Tamimi, do you agree with that? This is clearly a setback, but do you think a ceasefire and a long-term solution is still possible?
Well, Hamas, as a matter of principle, as I said earlier, is not opposed to the idea of a truce. And I myself, in my book on Hamas, had an entire chapter on this, the idea of a hudna, and how it came to be accepted by Hamas and what it means politically as well as realistically. Now, the problem here is that the Israelis are acting as if they can do whatever they like without being questioned, without being called to account, because they rely on the support of the so-called international community, which created their entity in the first place. It is as if we, the Palestinians, who were stripped of our land and who have been pushed into the diaspora, many of us, as if we are the villains and we are the criminals and they are the victims. Actually, they are the criminals. They are doing to us today what the Nazis did to the Jews in Europe. Exactly. This is what they're doing to us. It's Holocaust after Holocaust against the Palestinians. And by the way, if they think Hamas is weak, whatever they are doing to Hamas is making Hamas only stronger. They tried in 2008, 2009, they tried in 2012, now they're trying in 2014, and every time Hamas emerges stronger and more powerful and more confident, and the Israelis will have to pay for every crime they've committed against the Palestinians.
Gregg Roman, would you like to respond to what Azzam Tamimi just said?
First, to characterize the Israeli treatment of Palestinians as a Holocaust is a gross and defamatory accusation that cannot and should not stand on any modern news network. Second, the actions of Israel right now in the context of trying to protect Palestinians is one in the spirit of negotiations. Israel has every single interest not just to protect Israeli civilians, but also Palestinian civilians. It has an obligation under international law to make sure that every action that it takes is proportional, as using the previous speaker's arguments, in its actions. However, any modern nation state that is subjected to consistent rocket fire over 14 years, to consistent terrorism, and to rejection of the notion of negotiations, as Hamas has done time after time, deviates away from the path to peace. So both of these speakers are saying that land is the issue, that accused Israeli crimes are the issue. If so, they should be willing to sit at the table to accept any ceasefire and any long-term negotiations. And using the idea of a hudna or a tahida, which is a ceasefire or a long-term ceasefire with arms, would only help Hamas to get its legitimacy back with the Palestinian people by sitting at table with Israel. And in doing so, we heard about the fact that Hamas is the democratically elected government of the Palestinian people. I would remind you that this government resigned only 3 weeks ago after signing a unity agreement with Abu Mazen. So it's convenient for Hamas one day to work in cahoots with the Palestinian Authority, and then when the popular Palestinian opinion asks for a ceasefire, Hamas chooses to reject it and only use violence as its option in trying to achieve its means.
Greg, let me ask you about Israel's objective in the coming weeks. The aerial bombardments and neutralizing Hamas is not working. Is the objective now a ground invasion into Gaza and destroy Hamas completely? What's going to happen? Because clearly the rocket attacks are not going to stop right away. So what's Israel's objective?
So Israel has three objectives regarding its Operation Protective Edge. The first is to minimize the ability for Hamas to launch rockets and other infrastructure. The goal is not to decapitate Hamas, but it is to weaken it. The second goal of the operation is to ensure that Hamas has the what's called mowing the grass, which is a term created by the Institute for National Security Strategy in Tel Aviv. There's a certain amount of détente that existed for the last 2 years. But now that Hamas thinks that it has the ability to launch rocket attacks on Israel without consequences, it's inviting Israeli bombardment in turn. And the third goal is to use this as an opportunity to strengthen Abu Mazen and to strengthen the Palestinian public and the majority of Palestinians that want peace. Not because Israel seeks to keep on launching airstrikes against Hamas infrastructure, but because it chooses to use this as a way in which to strengthen the Palestinian forces that want peace and do not want violence.
Joseph Kechichian, just on one point Greg made there, saying the goal of Israel is to weaken Hamas but not decapitate it. How do you analyze that? What does it say to you?
Well, it hasn't happened before. They've said the same things repeatedly, and obviously this is the objective of any state, to essentially destroy or decapitate the enemy. But obviously the Israelis realize that at the end of the day they have to come to terms with the Palestinians as well. The collective punishment that is imposed on Gaza and the West Bank for many, many years has not really produced the kind of long-term peaceful situation that everybody desired. I think that in 2008, 2009, 2012, and now we are seeing the same thing repeated time and time again. And obviously Hamas has not weakened throughout this process. On the contrary, it has more sophisticated weapons. Lately, it has been using drones that presumably it smuggled. These are Iranian drones that were smuggled in. So therefore, weakening Hamas is not going to achieve anything for in the short term. And in the long term, it might actually strengthen Hamas further because it shows to its population that it can put up against a formidable military institution which the Israelis clearly possess. But all of this is secondary question to the point that I made at the very beginning. You're talking about a perennial problem over land. Let's not lose sight of that.
Okay, I'll give the last word to Azzam Tamimi in Istanbul. What is the best possible outcome to the current situation, Azzam Tamimi? And do you see Egypt playing a bigger role that would be accepted by Hamas? Would Hamas be willing to accept mediation by Egypt led by Sisi?
Well, if Egypt were to contact Hamas and speak to it as a respectable party to this conflict, Hamas wouldn't mind. The problem is that the current Egyptian regime is completely ignoring Hamas, as if Hamas doesn't exist on the face of the earth. And that will not work. Hamas is confident, Hamas is popular, and therefore, unless it is recognized as such by potential or respective mediators, it is unlikely to accept such mediation. So as a matter of principle, yes, a truce, a ceasefire is the way forward, but it has to be done fairly and with respect to Hamas as a fundamental party to this conflict.
Okay, thank you very much for an interesting discussion. Azzam Tamimi, Gregg Roman and Joseph Kechichian. And thank you all for watching this edition of Inside Story. And do please let us know your thoughts. You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Fully Batibo. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.